Hi, everyone. Welcome back to those of you that have joined us for previous sessions, and welcome to our new participants. I'm Cassie Rodriguez, a Donor Relations Manager for Water and Energy for Food, and I'm so excited to introduce you to the third session of the Water and Energy for Food Introductory Week. 40 innovators, 7 million people, and 19 billion liters. Lessons learned from SWIFT. Just a few housekeeping items before we continue. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the We for Food website and YouTube channel. Those who are not comfortable with this should feel free to leave the session. There is a Q&A box on the right-hand side, and you can submit your questions and comments in this Q&A box throughout the session, and we will answer them in the Q&A portion of the session. You have the option of submitting your questions anonymously. Note that we may not get to all your questions, and we will upload detailed responses to those unanswered questions on our website. Also, all sessions will be in English. There will be simultaneous transcription in French and Arabic. To turn these live captions and subtitles, please select Captions/Subtitles on using the closed caption icon in your video controls. To change the caption language, select the Settings icon and then Captions/Subtitles to choose your preferred language. There will be written transcription also available after the event, and we will post this announcement on the Q&A panel as well. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Koo McMahon, USAID Team Lead for Water and Energy for Food and the former Team Lead for Securing Water for Food for today's session. Koo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kat. And so first, let me just say to all of those who stuck around, thanks for sticking around. This program would not have been possible without the many taxpayers in the many countries, both in the U.S. through USAID, the people of that supported us through the government of the Netherlands, through Sweden, through the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, and from South Africa, from the South African Department of Science and Technology. And so of those donors, we really tried our best to really work together to help innovators grow and succeed, and to produce more food with less water, and to make more water available for food production, processing, and distribution throughout the food value chain. Next slide, please. And, you know, it is important to recognize the community that was created through the program. When we first started, we had no idea what would happen or what would become. It was, it was an experiment to see, where we could go. But from the innovators who are represented throughout this picture, through the government partners who are mostly on the right of the picture, to actual end users who are on the left of the picture, to our evaluators. We really were trying to do something where we could learn in process, evaluate, pivot, and shift. And so that's kind of what this community was able to achieve. And by no means were we successful in everything we tried, but we kept trying. Next slide, please. And so just to give you a little bit of background, between USAID and SIDA in the Netherlands and South Africa, the donor partners put approximately $34 million into this effort to address three core areas at the nexus of water and agriculture. One, on water reuse and efficiency. Two, on water capture and storage. How do you take water and get it when it's flooding and store it, and then use that water during more lean times, and then also salinity and saltwater intrusion. As the climates are changing and climate is evolving, and low-lying areas are becoming more saline, and groundwater sources are becoming more saline intruded. How do we help deal with that for agriculture? And so that's the core areas that the program was focusing on. Next slide, please. And so, as I talked about earlier, it was a huge community. We had, the donor partners who were providing the funding and the steering and the guidance. We also had the Innovation Investment Advisory Committee, which I'll talk about them a little bit more. We had the Swift Technical Assistance Facility, who were the core team who were working directly with our innovators. We had our rapid vendor procurement mechanism with a system of vendors scattered around the world who were providing direct technical assistance and support. And most importantly, the people we were actually funding, the innovations. And so one of the questions in the previous section was some of the innovations. So I'll just spend a minute or two just to give you a sense of the different types of things we funded. We funded salt tolerant and salt resistant crops. We funded saline potatoes. We funded separating manure and waste from agriculture to be reused. We funded water recycling systems. We funded Internet of Things type technologies, which could provide rapid data so farmers could basically sit in a bar and water their crops. We supported as well more focused efforts to bring women into agriculture, number one, or number two, to make sure that they had access to water and land rights. So those are, we funded many different things in the 40 things we funded, and I'll talk about that a bit more. Next slide, please. And so SWIFT was a global program focused in developing and emerging economies, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, including South and Southeast Asia, but also some in Central South America and Central and South America. And so you can see from the slide the many different locations where the innovators were working. Some innovators were working in just one country, some were working in multiple countries. Next slide, please. And so in SWIFT, we had a basic premise that we wanted to support post-pilot innovations to grow to wide-scale adoption. Now, for us, that meant 10,000 customers or end users at a minimum for tier 1 innovations. And that was, they were just getting past the validation stage and trying to grow. We also had tier 2 innovations, which were those where they'd already reached some scale, but we really wanted to juice and increase their scale to reach hundreds of thousands or millions of customers or end users. And so in the first year, which everybody was guaranteed their first year funding, and then they had to reach milestones thereafter to get additional funding. So in the first year for the tier 1s, they got 100,000 and up to 500,000 over 3 years if they met the additional year's milestones. In tier 2, they got $500,000 US dollars and up to 2 million if they reach their milestones in successive years for up to 3 years. Next slide, please. And so this slide you'll see over and over again in any of our presentations because it's fundamental to what we do, or what we did, excuse me, as SWIFT. It depended upon our Innovation Investment Advisory Committee and their recommendations, having a process to bring innovators who generally had never worked with governments before, let alone the US government, into our program and providing them with some basics and getting them set up so they could work with us. Then we would do some due diligence checks and make an award, and then provide them the base set of funding. Then we would work with them on the acceleration work plan and target setting, and I'm not going to go into that in detail because there's a whole different conversation that's going to happen in the Friday session on that. And then we would check in with them periodically throughout the year, and then have them report to us as far as actual data, both at the 6-month period and at the end of the year. And at the end of the year, we had our milestone review. So they had a set of technical and financial metrics and milestones which they needed to meet. And if they met 80% of the targets to those milestones, they generally moved on to the next year and went back around in the circle. And if they did not, then they would go out of the circle and become SWIFT alumni. After 3 times around the circle, that's 3 years, they would then, if they met all their targets or 80%, they would have been completed in the project and become SWIFT graduates. Next slide, please. And so there were some basic ways in which our program supported the innovators. This is primarily through the Swift Technical Assistance Facility, but also through other means. And so one was providing that needs-based technical assistant, market-driven product and business development, the training and acceleration support. We also helped them manage money. That many of these were new innovators. As far as like organizations were small, there were some were only 2 or 3 people, and so it was really hard sometimes for them to manage the money that we were giving them or that they were getting from others. So financial planning, looking forward, and also auditing and financial processes were one of the things we worked on. Also, to get better, you have to know what's happening and then be able to pivot. And so monitoring and evaluation was something that we did as a program that was really important, but also helping the entrepreneurs and the innovators we were working with understand and monitor what was happening on their own for their own business processes. And, you know, as is true for most businesses, developing their communication, their visual identity was extremely important to us because that helped them set a foundation and get known in the countries they were working, and also recognizing that partnerships were necessary, that you can't do everything by yourself, and that you needed sometimes to find people who are really good at what they do and partner with them instead of doing it yourself. And then finally, we helped them with project management and program logistics, moving things around, and to provide logistical support to them. Next slide. And so where we ended up, you know, as you can see, we were what we thought was ambitious in reaching 3 million customers or end users at the end of a 5-year program. And we greatly exceeded that. And that was mainly due to some of our tier 2 innovations, which really did reach hundreds of thousands of households and hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of customers and end users. And primarily we were focused on farmers, but there were a few other end users in that group as well. Next slide, please. Similarly, we thought we were ambitious in our water targets and our food targets, but you know, thankfully, our innovators greatly exceeded where we thought they would be. You know, compared to traditional practices, and because the government was starting to tax water and monitor it in 2 or 3 places, we were able to get some very detailed data on what the farmers were doing before, and then how much water they were no longer needing to use because they were more efficient in their processes. And so that led to agricultural water consumption reductions of around 19 billion liters. Now, to be clear, that was focused primarily in 2 or 3 of the innovations that we had, and most of them were in the $500 million range as far as their water consumption reductions, and some were not focused on that, and so they didn't have that target. Similarly, we reached about 6.8 million tons of crops grown as a result of using the Swift innovations, and 8 million hectares of land under improved production. And that's both agricultural land for raising crops as well as herding and grazing and farmland. Next slide, please. So I'm going to shift here a bit and talk about what we learned and what might be useful either to other programs or to innovators who are joining these types of programs. One was that milestone-based funding and acceleration support, while not always positive amongst the enterprises, the innovators, was really appreciated, number one, and really helped them. So what we found was that some of our innovations were research organizations, so they weren't used to being held accountable for doing anything besides publishing a report. So reaching out to customers and end users was really surprising to them, and so they weren't prepared nor ready for that, and often they were the ones who weren't successful in the program. We did have some not-for-profit organizations who were actually really good about that and were able to pivot and shift and grow. In addition, we found that for-profit enterprises often were a bit better at this and knowing that they had targets that they needed to meet to grow, but the funding alone wasn't enough. Even with the milestones, you really needed that technical assistance and that acceleration support to work with these innovators in a one-on-one fashion. And we'll talk about that in our TA session on Friday. Next slide, please. And so one example of that was Project Alba, who offered partnerships to farmers and provided technical support and inputs and tools to farmers. So our lesson learned for them was the milestone funding helped them to deliver greater support than just the dollars alone. But we also found that they weren't successful in the end, at least not as of a year and a half ago, that what's happening in the country sometimes matters more than any support we can give. And we do our best, but sometimes folks just don't make it through to the next stage of the program. Next slide, please. The second lesson was around capacity building on grants management. Next slide, please. And so one specific example here was IBAR Engineering in Ethiopia. You know, you had an entrepreneur who used to work for the government who was, you know, very good as a scientist, but as a business person, he wanted to help people. He, you know, brought in a lot of women to work in his factory, but there wasn't necessarily the best accounting practices. And so what we did was work with him to both bring in stronger accounting and financial management, so he knew where the money was coming from and where the money was going, and to strengthen his business. And so, you know, one of the things we learned is that when you don't have policies, practices, and procedures as a new enterprise in place, that can really slow you down and prevent you from growing to wide-scale adoption. And so we moved them from just basic and acceptable to really operational in that space. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, multi-stakeholder collaboration is extremely important, as well as the flexibility and the ability to pivot. Next slide, please. As we all know, in this current time, the world is rapidly changing, both due to changes from climate resilience, due to COVID, and just structural and transformational change with young people. And so you can't do everything alone. And so what this slide is showing you is the many ways in which the SWIFT innovators work with each other, sometimes through the program, sometimes just on their own, to really try to bring these things together. And this is what I mean by the community that was developed, that they talk to each other on Facebook and in other places online, and not just working with each other, they formed more than 300 partnerships with other organizations to help move their innovations forward. Next slide, please. This is probably the key message that I want to make sure goes across to the audience, that you have to make sure you're creating a viable financial model and marketing strategy. Too often in the innovation community, it's about the innovation. It's got to be transformative or game changing, instead of focusing on the customer or the end user. What's the problem you're trying to solve? The people that you want to help, do they want your solution? Is it affordable to them? And those are things that are often, you know, sidetracked or sidelined instead of being the focus and the core of innovation programming and design. Next slide, please. So one example is Mimosa Tech. And so they're an Internet of Things technology provider who works on irrigation solutions and real-time monitoring of water in Vietnam. And so they, you know, between soil, moisture, rain, and wind, they give precise solutions to farmers. And so the challenge they were having is they were so focused on their technology and continuing to make better versions of their technology, they didn't ever, in the beginning, stop to say, our technology is good enough, but what about our customers? Do we have a viable strategy? Do we have a marketing plan to reach them? Are we doing the right things around that? And so thankfully, you know, we went on the ground and we're listening to them and their customers and could see, and we said, hey, your technology is good. Your customers think it works, but you need to reach more of them, otherwise you won't survive. And so that viable marketing strategy, reaching the right customers, and having a plan for growth and scale over time is the most important thing for these organizations to survive, because donor dollars won't be around forever, and these organizations need to learn to create a financially viable, sustainable model on their own to survive without us, but for now, with our help and support to help them grow. Next slide, please. Another example of a not-for-profit organization is Meat Naturally. Based in South Africa and then expanding, they had to work on financial sustainability and develop a financial plan and viable business models in their early stages to spin off the not-for-profit to a for-profit model, and that really worked for them. And then we've got another example from not-for-profits from ICU. Same organization, two different innovations that we supported. One of them was successful, ICU Peru. though their main partnership collapsed in the first year, we worked with them in the partnership strategy to find a new partner, and that partnership still thrives and exists 5 years later now. But ICU Jordan also had, a challenge with their partnership, but they weren't able to uptake our support and then have a viable strategy long term. So same big picture organization globally, two different private sector partners they were working with. One was successful, one was not. Next slide, please. So this is extremely important, and I'm going to keep coming back to the foundational principle. The customer is what the focus should be, and that is the end user. And so incorporating design and marketing and feedback from women, who represent in some countries 70% of smallholder farmers, is the key concern and should be the key concern for all of the innovators and enterprises wanting to work in developing countries. Next slide, please. And so one of those was Green Heat for us, and they're based in Uganda. It's a slurry separation system which helps farmers create biogas as an offshoot and get sludge that they can then use on farmland. Generally, the farmers had a cow or two. In some cases, in more industrial settings or university settings, you were able to take human waste and let it degrade so that you could get the methane and then use it on crops. But what we found was they didn't focus early on the benefits of the technology to women. It was just around the gas generation and energy generation. But when through the customer and end user interviews, women had some specific things around time savings, around savings of energy, around their ability to do other things as a result of the technology that weren't at all in the marketing or really thought about. And so the design was modified to address that. So in some cases, some of our innovators became more profitable because they incorporated design and marketing feedback from women. And in many cases, women using Swift innovations have had many more benefits than even our innovators or the program had initially foreseen. Next slide, please. So this is one of the key challenges for many development programs, including ours, is insufficient measurement and integration of the base of the pyramid into the program. So the base of the pyramid to us means those who have the least funds in society, who are sometimes, depending on the country, surviving on $1 a day, in other countries on $3 a day. Next slide, please. And so we struggle to measure them. One, because sometimes they are uncomfortable saying how much money they make or don't make. And, people are proud and don't want to tell you how they're struggling. They want to tell you how they're succeeding. And so that was also a challenge for our innovators, that in their applications, they claimed to benefit low to middle income farmers, but helping them and measuring that is extremely challenging. And so we took extra efforts to hire field evaluators to go out to the field. We went out ourselves as the program, our innovators went out to really try to talk and have focus groups and end user interviews, cluster randomized samples to find these folks who were using these innovations, who were at the base of the pyramid, and understand what was working for them and what wasn't. And so that work also led us to then create the Base of the Pyramid Innovator Guidebook to help small and medium enterprises who want to work with the base of the pyramid have concrete and actionable strategies to really address their needs, look at how to make them customers, how to do financing such that they could potentially afford innovations. And we highly recommend that. And it's both on the Securing Water for Food and the We for Food website. Next slide, please. Then we have the lack of local presence and networks in the region to support the enabled environment. Now, if any of you are still around from the previous session from the external evaluation of SWIFT, you'll learn that this is their key take-home message. And it is a key take-home message for us as donors and what we've tried to build through Water and Energy for Food. Next slide, please. And so, when we started, the SWIFT Technical Assistance Facility failed to take into account the local context needed. We were working with a consortium of 3 organizations, two of which were based in the US and had worked in Silicon Valley and were used to working in the developed country context, not in the developing emergency economy context where the governments might not be responsive, where time might be slower, where it's harder to reach people and it's more rural. And so what we did over time was build our vendor network to include more local technical assistance providers who had that context, who understood the specific needs and challenges of developing and emerging economy innovators. And so that also changed our cycles as far as when we put out RFPs, when we understood that agricultural needs and farming practices were seasonal, and so we needed to work around that. And then we also were able to connect in a few cases with local governments to change the policies to benefit innovators, to make sure there were more government standards around certain sectors of the industry. But that was more ad hoc, and really that's the focus of the new program, Water and Energy for Food. Next slide, please. This was also a key one that, I think incubators and accelerators ignore sometimes to their detriment. Next slide, please. It is the fact that the innovators need to be fully engaged and involved. They are partners in the process, and not, we're going to create like a whole week of workshops that you're going to go and you're going to participate in. You're going to get everything you need out of. Rather, it is, what are your specific needs? How can we work as a group with a larger group of innovators to understand that? And how can we work with you one-on-one to directly address those needs? And so by engaging the innovators in the scope of work development in the beginning, or failing to, we were missing out on what they could learn from. So we changed our process. We started to engage the innovators earlier on in the scope development, understanding from the diagnostic, and having them understand what's going on and put their own skin in the game with their time. And then at the end of the process, having their responses on whether or not it was successful and was it working for them. And over time, we went from 50% of the stuff that we were doing was working to 100%. And now, to be clear and to be fair, we didn't achieve and reach all of their needs or meet what they needed all the time. So sometimes there were just technical assistance needs we couldn't respond to or give because we didn't have the capacity to do. But in general, we helped them in many ways across the 25 innovators that were graduates and the overall 40 innovators. Next slide, please. And this, I think, is also quite important, that you need to fully integrate financial transactions for all stages of innovators and end users. Next slide, please. And what I mean by that is, one of the things that, our program did not do early on was fully understand where the innovators were coming from, in the sense that we had some innovators that, were mom and pop shops that just wanted to do good and make enough money to survive. We had some innovators that really wanted to, make a lot of money, but also help people. And we had some that didn't want to make any money at all and weren't really at all focused on being financially viable. And surviving. They just wanted to do good work. And so with each of those different groups, there's a different strategy or different strategies that have to be undertaken. One, to help them understand what their needs are, to see where they can go long term, who they need to partner with, and where the funds can come from for them. Sometimes it's working with the government and basically just creating the innovation, getting it uptaken by the government, and letting that scale widely through a country. Sometimes it's staying in the private sector, and sometimes it's being bought up by someone else who has a wider reach, and they can just put your innovation into that wider section. So I think that covers the gamut of the lessons learned. There's a whole failures, pivots, and lessons learned report that was mentioned in the previous session, and there are, trust me, we failed a lot, and we learned some valuable lessons and tried to get better, and we're going to continue to try to get better through this Water and Energy for Food program that we've developed. So I think with that, Cassie, I'll bring you back in and we can turn to questions.
Hi, Ku, thanks. So we have been receiving questions in the Q&A panel. Since you are the expert and perhaps you'd like to select which questions you'd like to answer, we have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Sure. So the first question was around We for Food, and I'll answer it even if this is a SWIFT session, and because We for Food fundamentally is taking the best lessons learned from SWIFT and our sister program Powering Ag, who will have its evaluation session and lessons learned session tomorrow. Taking the best lessons from those two and bringing it into Water and Energy for Food. So depending on the region, and the Regional Innovation Hub, the criteria for the minimum number of customers and end users will vary. But in general, we'd say, you have to have proven yourself and demonstrated beyond the pilot. So a minimum of 1,000 customers and end users, in some regions, 5,000 in others. So hopefully but that will be very clear in the calls for innovation that begin to be released by the different regions in the fall. The second question, was there any evidence that the recurring one-year period for milestones was insufficient to see the intended impact on the ground? And I'd say the evidence was mixed, but significant evidence was demonstrated that 1 year was more than enough time to see impact of evidence on the ground. For example, with one of our innovators working in Egypt, the innovator noted they'd been working around this, the crops and saline-resistant crops for more than 30 years. And because there was now a focus around milestones, that really shifted both their language and their communication and messaging, both to the people they were working with, to the government, and to their partners, that they had to demonstrate and they had to actually show progress. And that shifted them to make more progress in 1 year than they had in some cases in 15 or 20 years. Similarly, we had innovators who, because of the pressure, and it is a pressure of having to meet the milestones, some people, jokingly but not so jokingly, told me they had to postpone their engagement for marriage because they were so focused on making the progress necessary to continue in the program. And I say that to say it is not by any means easy. And there are more than a few innovators who weren't able to do that. But in every case, we could see whether or not there was progress in a year because they're working with end users, because we could see whether or not there was a change as far as the amount of money they were able to raise or bring in because of the partners that they had. And so if they weren't able in 1 year to demonstrate those things, given, with climate variability and those things, how important it is to make significant progress quickly and be able to pivot and shift quickly, then they weren't viable in this program. Another question was specific tools and frameworks that you need to do the assessment and the considerations for that. Yes. So one of the things we had was the innovator needs diagnostic, and that was not only that, we had a call for innovations, they answered the question, they had an application and they put some backup documentation behind that. If they made it into the program, the first thing we did was we had them do a self-assessment of where they were on a variety of factors, both around their technology, around where they were as far as the policy level and with their government, and were they able to operate easily or was it difficult, around the amount of money that they had and the money they raised, around the HR and how their organization was set up and that stuff, and then also around their ability to receive our funding and technical assistance. And so we would have them do a self-assessment, and then we would do a diagnostic and assessment, and we would monitor them over time, and that became compounded in what we called the Solver Scale Score. So we looked at their diagnostic and what they were doing and looked at the likelihood for them over time to reach the scale that we were talking about for wide-scale adoption. And in fact, many of the people and organizations that were able to improve their diagnostic scores over time also saw their Solver Scale scores go up and were more likely to become graduates of the program. The next question, are there any efforts to establish or implement cross-learnings in the agricultural sectors of the donor countries? Yes. And so that was a weakness in this program. It was focused on the innovators and not the enabling environment. And so, based on both what we learned In the program and the external evaluation, the donor partners for the follow-on program, We for Food, have made the enabling environment and these regional innovation hubs a core component of the program. It will be about, in part, technical assistance to other organizations, investors, lenders, governments, nonprofits, to help educate them on the specific challenges at the nexus of water, energy, food, and innovation, and smallholder farmers, around that smallholder farmer financing, and around what we've learned already and what we will continue to learn, and taking the learnings from the new program and then both bringing them up in the policy level at the regional space and where relevant at the global space to address challenges. And so the next question was, 7 million farmers is very impressive. Are they still engaged in service operations after the project ended? How much percentage remain customers? 100% or much less because of business sustainability innovation. So I'm going to take this question from two different ways, from an innovator perspective and an end user perspective. From the innovator perspective, we funded 40 organizations. Of those 40, 25 of them made it beyond their first year, which means they met enough 80% of their targets and milestones and continued on. Of those 15 that didn't make it, 7 or so, if I remember correctly, continued on their own without our funding. 8 did not. Of the 25, as far as I know, and obviously, they've left the program at different points in time, and we do send out, graduate and alumni surveys to try to figure out what's happening to them after the fact. But those 25 are still in operation, or with one exception, and that's because the person that was managing the program didn't continue on in the organization. But as we all know, COVID has changed things a bit, and so our ability to keep tabs on things has diminished a bit. And many of those who meet the minimum requirements as far as the customers and end users from the old program, hopefully, based on what the people in the regional innovation hubs say, will move into the new program. Now, the second part of that is from the end users. So based on both the external evaluation and our field evaluator surveys, between 90 and 100% for all of the innovations of the end users said not only would they continue to use the innovation, but they would recommend the innovations to their relatives and other people in their communities. So on that side of sustainability, we're there. On the financial sustainability, many of the innovators are struggling because of COVID. They had cash reserves to get them through some lean times, but the investment has gone down a bit. Their ability to buy and sell has gone down. Agricultural markets, commodities have gone down, and so they're holding on right now, but they're struggling. And so it remains unclear, if after COVID, folks will still be around, but we're trying. The next question was, have you assessed the sustainability of the investments made? Have you gone back to see the farmers continue to use technologies and methods learned? Yes. And so to be clear, in some cases, I personally, in the beginning of the program, with the technical assistance facility team, went out to the field, and we both interview and talk with and try to provide TA to the enterprises themselves. But it was extremely important for me to see what was happening on the ground with the farmers. And so not only did we interview them once, in some cases, because of the external surveyors or the external evaluator, they were interviewed 2 or 3 years later. I'll share one specific story. I went to Bangladesh with Practical Action, and so I was asking, how sustainable is this? And so a farmer told me, what do you mean, how sustainable is this? Practical Action hasn't been here in 2 years. We've been working on our own for 2 years. Of course, this is sustainable. We're still doing it on our own. And that is one example where the innovations, once the farmers get to use them and they're comfortable with them, they generally work. Now, there are some cases either because, of floods or droughts where the innovations no longer work. But in most cases, they did what they were supposed to over time. Now, also to be clear, we did, through our external evaluation and field surveyors, when they went back and talked to farmers a year or 2 years later, asked if they were still using the innovation, why or why not. And most farmers said it's because it's making money for me or because it's saving me time. And that was true both for men and women, but as noted in the external evaluation, men benefited more than women, and middle income users benefited more than the lowest income users. Okay, the next question was, the end users reached decelerated dramatically in the final 3 years of the program. It's a bit counterintuitive to most innovative scale-up models, which you see the highest growth rates come at the latest stage acceleration. Was this decrease due to lack of market demand for the innovations or for expiring of the subsidies for deployment? Sure. So what was happening there is it was the number of organizations that we were working with. That, you know, when we started, we were working with 16. And then, you know, in years 2 and 3, it was the first round of innovations we worked with, plus the second and the third rounds of innovation. So they were all working at the same time. So then we were at about 30 organizations, and then they all phased out of the program. And then we were in the last year only working with, I think, 7 organizations. So what happens is over time, the number of organizations you're working with are the people who are giving you data and reporting. And so we didn't have a lot of data at the beginning. Then we got more data right in the middle of the program, and that's when we had more people reporting. And then at the end, you know, the number of organizations we were working with goes down. And so we don't have data on that. So we don't report anything that we don't have the backup data for. And so if they've left the program and they haven't submitted backup data, even if they continue to grow, and many of the organizations have continued to grow, we don't report that unless in the alumni or graduate survey, they send us that additional information. The second part of that is in round 1 and round 3, we had very large tier 2 organizations who really rapidly scaled and grew, whereas in round 4, we only had 1 tier 2, and they didn't rapidly scale and grow to the extent they did as far as the number of countries they were in. They expanded to 5 countries, but the number of customers and end users they had at the end of their 3rd year was lower than for 2 of for the previous rounds. And so that's where that difference comes from. But, you know, we hope that these organizations will continue to grow and scale either with our support or without it. And in fact, we've seen most of these organizations, what happens is that with the program, they rapidly scale, and then often they stabilize, and then their rate of growth or rate of change is a little bit lower because they don't have, quote unquote, the juice from the specific and TA needs. And what often happens, I've heard anecdotally from some innovators, is that they are without the milestones coming from somewhere else, that their businesses start to lose their way a little bit. They don't have a North Star as much anymore. And so their marketing channels, their strategies become a little bit diffuse, I guess is the simplest term, such that their rate of change, because there's not someone else that's working with them and say, hey, what's happening? They don't have that coach anymore. And so that changes that sometimes. And so we're working to try to improve that and build earlier in the program in We4Food some of those tactics and strategies and techniques for the enterprises, such that when they leave, it's kind of more ingrained rather than something they got in year 2 and they're trying to move forward in year 4 to do. And Cassie, I think that's it. Is there anything I've missed?
No, I think that was all. Thank you, Koo, for a very insightful presentation on the lessons learned from SWIFT and their implications in the new program, We4Food. So thank you so much for the presentation and your time. I'd also like to take an opportunity to thank everyone that joined us today and participated in submitting questions. For the remaining questions that we didn't have an opportunity to answer, as we mentioned before, we will be uploading those responses to our website along with the recording of this webinar. And I'd like to also invite everyone that joined us today to join us again tomorrow for the Powering Agriculture sessions, including a presentation on the final evaluation and a presentation on the impact and lessons learned from the program. So yes, just a reminder to make sure to continue to tune in for the rest of the week as we share more water, energy, and ag content. That's all cool for me. Are there any additional remarks or final remarks from your end?
No, just thanks to everyone who joined. Obviously, you can reach out to us through the Water and Energy for Food website if you've got questions, and we're happy to work with folks. And over the next, the rest of this week, and then in 2 or 3 weeks when we talk about the regional innovation hubs, that'll be more specific in how they're organized and how to partner with them. I think that was one of the wrap-up questions that came in. And so we hope to be able to continue to connect and learn and grow and help enterprises do the same.